Welcome back to US History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression and the overall impact on everyday life. So we're going to identify the challenges that everyday Americans face as a result of the Great Depression, and take a look at the government's initial unwillingness to provide help. We'll explain the particular challenges that African Americans faced, the unique challenges that farmers faced, and the Great Depression's influence on American values and popular culture. So, by 1932, the Great Depression had affected 60 million Americans. The economic collapse touched everywhere, from industrial cities to rural farms. Millions of people were unemployed, homeless, and starving. The crisis revealed deep weaknesses in the American economic system, and the government and private charities were unprepared for the scale of human suffering. Um, in this photo, we see just a mile-long line of people lining up for free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. There were private organizations that ran that sort of soup line setup, and it just was a drop in the bucket for the needs. In major cities, unemployment rates exceeded the national averages. In Chicago, there were 500,000 unemployed workers in the early 1930s. New York City had 1 million unemployed people and 50,000 homeless by the end of 1932. Bread lines and soup kitchens served as many as 85,000 meals a day just in the city of New York. Even as late as 1939, over 60% of rural households were still classified as impoverished. So, the Great Depression lasted a decade, and we're going to talk a little bit about how families survived, and also why it took so long for help. So, families first used any savings that they had accumulated. Those with insurance policies cashed them out for survival money. Insurance cash payments tripled in the first 3 years of the Depression. When savings ran out, people started borrowing. Eventually, families stopped paying rent and mortgage payments. Evicted families moved in with relatives, um, accelerating their financial collapse and creating a downward spiral. Right, so we took it in stages. Nobody knew when the Great Depression started that it was going to be the Great Depression. It was just about trying to survive each phase as it came. Children faced hunger. Um, we had kids in coastal cities looking on the docks for spoiled vegetables to bring home, children begging at neighbors' doors for table scraps. One depression survivor said, "You get used to hunger, and after the first few days, it doesn't even hurt. You just feel weaker." In 1931, there were 20 documented cases of starvation. 3 years later, that number had grown to 110 cases. In rural areas, much likely had higher numbers that weren't documented. The middle class experienced hunger, but not necessarily starvation like the lower classes did. So, how did people try to survive? Well, they stayed in bed to save fuel and avoid burning calories. They ate parts of animals previously considered waste. They scavenged for scrap wood to burn in furnaces. When electricity was shut off, people tapped into their neighbors' wires illegally. As family members would share single pieces of clothing, taking turns wearing them. One girl actually told her teacher, "I can't go home for food. It's my sister's turn to eat." And so you can see the desperation here trying to keep everybody alive. Um, you can also see why many people were very angry with the president at the time for not doing more. Um, well, limited help. Why was the help limited? The American Red Cross organization refused to provide widespread relief. The chairman argued that unemployment was an act of man, not an act of God, and so it was sort of like, well, go get a job. But of course, there were hundreds of people applying for every job. Private charities like the Elks tried to help, but didn't have enough resources to do much. Religious organizations at the time remained on the front lines, offering food and shelter. By 1932, there were as many as 82 bread lines just in New York City. That it still was a drop in the bucket for what was needed. So, how did this affect African Americans? African Americans didn't participate as much in the stock market boom before the crash, but they suffered effects even worse. Discrimination, right, hits twofold during a time of difficulty. By 1932, roughly half of all Black Americans were unemployed. White workers conspired to have Black workers fired and tried to take their jobs, and even jobs that traditionally were held by Black workers went to white people. There was a lot of racial discrimination there, either by the employer or the people applying, or both. You know, if 20 people applied for a job, and one of the 20 people was white, it often went to the white person, not the black person. Racial violence increased. There's a lot of blame, desperation, hatred, competition for jobs and resources. And so violence increased during this time as well. So, for example, in 1931, 9 black boys were arrested after an altercation on a train. They were falsely accused of rape by 2 white women, and an all-white jury convicted them, despite the lack of evidence. In fact, one woman actually took back or recanted her testimony later, but the conviction stood, and 8 out of the 9 boys were sentenced to death. The case was tried 3 times with appeals and overturned convictions. And eventually it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that the defendants were denied adequate legal representation. And they went to prison for decades for something that they didn't do. They avoided execution, but the majority of them spent the rest of their lives in prison. And they were not granted pardons until after they had died in 2013. The government went back and granted pardons. So the case exposed the injustice of all white juries and poor legal counsel and highlighted systemic racism in the American court system. It's also going to lead to another wave of civil rights movement. The civil rights movement struggled during the Great Depression because people were focused on surviving. But this discrimination was still happening. All right, so next up is how did it affect farmers? So farmers in the Great Plains had prospered from 1900 through World War I, but after World War I, prices dropped drastically. For example, wheat prices had gone from $2 to 40 cents per bushel. So that's, like a 75% cut in value. And then in 1931, right during the Great Depression, a huge drought began and lasted 8 terrible years. Dust storms created huge choking clouds that piled up. And in the year of 1935 alone, 850 million tons. 850 million tons. A ton is 2,000 pounds. So you can just imagine that math. The volume of topsoil, dirt, literally dirt, that blew away, was unnatural and was partly drought and partly due to severe overfarming. The topsoil had lost its natural nutrients from being overfarmed, and so it was more susceptible to being blown. Geologists estimate that it actually takes 500 years to naturally regenerate 1 inch of topsoil. So just imagine 850 million tons, how long it took the Great Plains to recover from that. And so this devastated farmers. Livestock died or had to be sold. Crops withered and died. A new illness spread called dust pneumonia from the constant dust that was being breathed in. Farmers lost their homes. Country banks failed. Farms were mortgaged, and sold for next to nothing and foreclosed upon, and people picked up and left. Many of these farmers simply walked away from their land. They packed up and moved on. And this was quite a famous time in their life. Thousands of Oklahoma's citizens packed up what they could and left and became known as the Okies. And they represented the failure of America to deliver on its promise. So the story, if you've heard of the Grapes of Wrath, kind of is a fictional story that follows this real event where they migrated west seeking agricultural work in California, and kind of symbolized Depression era Americans. So with all of this, American culture begins to shift. Before the Depression, we focused on individualism and material success. The 1920s glorified self-made people and wealth accumulation. And now things began to shift towards community and collective welfare and the unity, the well-being of the country and the people as a whole. Movies became a form of escape, distraction from hardships. The movies themselves began reflecting themes of community strength and family values, and the everyday person fighting against greedy banks and corporations became a popular theme. Art and music also shifted. The song "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime" became the anthem of the Great Depression, and it spoke to the plight or the struggle of the common man and appealed to community values. Lyrics of the time reflected workers' lost dreams, desperation, um, and other popular songs offered an escape, right? Happy days are here again. Hope that things would come come back around. So you can take a few moments to reflect on the questions. How did the Depression era culture influence American values long term? What role did entertainment play in helping people survive the crisis? Why might films about community and family values have been so popular? And so on. We'll stop there.